Kennedy, Johnson, and Civil Rights. Lecture terms. The Civil Rights Revolution. Focus question. What were the major events in the civil rights movement of the early 1960s? The rising tide of protest. Through the sit-ins, college students became the leading force for social change. In 1960, young black activists, along with a few whites, in Raleigh, North Carolina, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. This committee would work to replace segregation with what they called a, quote, beloved community of racial justice, and it would give blacks control over the decisions that affected their lives. Direct actions of many sorts followed the sit-ins. Blacks demanded access to segregated beaches and pools. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, launched the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups traveled on buses into the Deep South to force compliance with court orders banning segregation in interstate transportation. Violent mobs attacked them and burned the buses while police stood by. The Freedom Rides forced the federal desegregation of interstate transportation. Escalating protests saw the growing resistance by local authorities, however. Late in 1961, the SNCC and other groups began a nonviolent campaign against racial discrimination in Albany, Georgia. The protests lasted a year, and demonstrators' filling of jails failed to win national sympathy. In late 1962, a court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, a black student. State police did nothing as a mob, encouraged by the state's governor, rioted. 2 people were killed, and President Kennedy dispatched Army troops to restore order there. Demonstrations. Protests crested in 1963 as demonstrations against inequalities in education, employment, and housing spread throughout the South. In 1 week in June, more than 15,000 were arrested in 186 cities. This wave of discontent culminated in Birmingham, Alabama, a deep South city with a history of violence against blacks since World War II. When local blacks protesting for more economic opportunity and the desegregation of local businesses had little success, Martin Luther King Jr. came to the city. While in jail for violating a ban on demonstrations, King wrote his eloquent Letter from a Birmingham Jail. King excoriated local clergy who asked for patience and recounted the daily abuses black Southerners faced. He asked white moderates to abandon fears of disorder and commit themselves to racial justice. When King decided to have black school children join the protests, the city's police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered brutal attacks with nightsticks, fire hoses, and attack dogs. Televised images of the repression outraged national and world opinion and led President Kennedy to begin to embrace the civil rights movement's goals. Leading businessmen, fearing damage to the city's reputation, ended the protests by desegregating stores and restaurants and by promising to hire blacks. Birmingham forced white Americans to decide whether they had more in common with citizens demanding basic rights or with the violent segregationists. The assassination of Medgar Evers, an NAACP official in Mississippi, and the bombing of a black church in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls later in 1963, made the question even more pointed. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 black and white Americans participated in the March on Washington. This was considered by many the high point of the civil rights movement. Organized by a coalition of civil rights, labor, and church groups, it was the largest protest in American history up to that time. Crying for jobs and freedom, the marchers called for passage of a civil rights bill in Congress, as well as a public works program to fight unemployment and a minimum wage increase. They also requested a law barring discrimination in employment. On the Lincoln Memorial steps, Martin Luther King, Jr. said his most famous words in what is now known as his "I Have a Dream" speech. While the march showed the movement's potential, including unity between blacks and whites, it also showed the movement's limits. All the speakers were male, despite the critical role of women in the movement. Organizers also pressed the SNCC leader, John Lewis, to remove militant messages from his speech. The Kennedy years. Focus question: what were the major crises and policy initiatives of the Kennedy presidency? Kennedy and the world. Though John F. Kennedy was president for only 3 years and accomplished little in domestic affairs, his administration is now seen as a time of high hopes and U.S. world leadership. In his inaugural address in 1961, Kennedy promised that a, quote, new generation of Americans would pay any price, bear any burden, to assure the survival and success of liberty. This seemed to be asking Americans to transcend 1950s consumerism and sacrifice for the common good. But Kennedy ignored the growing civil rights movement at the time, and he focused on his main interest: vigorously fighting the Cold War. Kennedy tried to increase U.S. influence and check communist power in the world with several programs, including the Peace Corps, which sent young Americans to assist economic and educational work in developing nations. He also focused on a space program that would send Americans to the moon after the Soviets first launched a satellite carrying the first man into orbit around the Earth. This eventually happened in 1969. Kennedy also formed a new Latin America policy called the Alliance for Progress, which ended up being a smaller Marshall Plan for the region that would fight poverty and challenge communism in the area. But military regimes and local elites controlled and took most of the alliance funds, and few of Latin America's poor benefited from this program. Like Truman and Eisenhower, Kennedy saw the world through a Cold War lens, including events in Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro successfully led forces that overthrew the regime of the Cuban dictator, Batista. Under Batista, Cuba had been an economic dependency of the United States, and when Castro's government started to nationalize Americans' lands and investments and sell sugar to the Soviet Union, Eisenhower stopped trade with the island, and the Central Intelligence Agency began to train anti-Castro exiles for an invasion. In April 1961, Kennedy let the CIA invade at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a colossal failure and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union instead. Kennedy's administration tried assassinations and other tactics to get rid of Castro, but failed. Kennedy crises. Relations between the United States and the USSR worsened under Kennedy's administration. In August 1961, to deter immigrants from fleeing from eastern to western Berlin, the Soviets built a wall separating the two parts of the city. Until its demolition in 1989, the Berlin Wall symbolized the Cold War and the division of Europe between free and communist. But a far more dangerous crisis developed in Cuba in October of 1962, where U.S. spy planes discovered that the Soviets were installing missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to United States targets. The Russians' motives are still unclear, but the Kennedy administration refused to accept the missile's presence, and this ultimately started the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy rejected the military advice to invade Cuba, which would have very likely triggered a Soviet attack in Berlin and perhaps a nuclear war. Instead, he imposed a blockade or, quote, quarantine of the island of Cuba, demanding the missile's removal completely. Tense behind-the-scenes negotiations led Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to ultimately withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. promises not to invade Cuba and to secretly remove its own missiles from Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union. For 13 days, the world was on the brink of total nuclear war, and the crisis diminished Kennedy's Cold War enthusiasm. The next year, Kennedy tried to reduce tensions by appealing for more cooperation, and that year, the United States and the USSR agreed to a treaty banning nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere and in space. In 1963, civil rights began to distract Kennedy from the Cold War. Kennedy had been reluctant to support black demands, and he seemed to share the fears of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, that the movement was inspired by communism. Kennedy waited until 1962 to ban discrimination in federal housing, which had been a 1960 campaign promise of his. He used force only when federal law was blatantly violated, but he would not protect civil rights workers from violence, insisting that law enforcement was a local responsibility instead of a federal one. The Birmingham protests convinced Kennedy that the United States could not portray itself as the champion of freedom in the world while it maintained a system of racial inequality. So in June, he called for a law banning discrimination in all public accommodations, a major goal of the civil rights struggle. But Kennedy died before the Civil Rights Bill was enacted. On November 22, 1963, while riding in a motorcade through Dallas, Texas, he was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, a troubled former Marine. Oswald's assassination 2 days later by a local businessman has fostered speculation about conspiracies to this very day. Kennedy's death shocked the nation, and his delayed commitment to civil rights ultimately fell to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Focus question: what were the purposes and strategies of Johnson's Great Society programs? Johnson and civil rights. Unlike Kennedy, who came from a wealthy and powerful family and seemed to view success as a birthright, Lyndon B. Johnson grew up poor in the impoverished Texas Hill Country and struggled to achieve wealth and power himself. By the 1950s, he was a majority leader of the U.S. Senate, but he never forgot the poor white and Mexican children that he had taught in the 1930s in a school. More than Kennedy, he was committed to New Deal social programs that assisted the less fortunate because of his background. Immediately upon taking office, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had championed before his assassination. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which barred racial discrimination in employment, institutions such as hospitals and schools, and privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It also banned discrimination on the grounds of sex, although this provision was added to by opponents of civil rights who hoped to derail the bill. It was embraced by liberal and female members of Congress, however. Johnson knew that many whites opposed the law, and he feared the South would turn Republican in the election that year. But the 1964 law did not address blacks' right to vote in the South. That summer, a coalition of civil rights groups started a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North traveled there to take part in a campaign called Freedom Summer. Violence was quick and deadly, including bombings, beatings, and the murder of 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Though many black civil rights workers had been killed, the deaths of the 2 white youths grabbed national attention and revealed federal indifference to violence against citizens claiming their rights. Freedom Summer also led to the dramatic campaign by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, to take seats of the state's all-white official party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. As blacks were barred from Democratic activities or registering to vote, civil rights activists created the MFDP, open to all citizens. Fannie Lou Hamer of the MFDP captivated the country in televised hearings in which she recounted her history of poverty and beatings by police for civil rights work. Johnson feared that Southern Democrats would abandon the party if the MFDP delegates were seated, and the MFDP rejected a compromise to seat only 2 black delegates. The 1964 election. The 1964 Democratic Convention weakened blacks' faith that they could use the political system and foretold the break between Democratic liberals and the civil rights movement that would follow. But the movement did ultimately rally behind Johnson's campaign for re-election. Johnson's Republican opponent was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, whose 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, had sold more than 3 million copies. Goldwater demanded a more aggressive Cold War stance, but mostly criticized, quote, internal threats to freedom, especially the New Deal welfare state. He called for private charity to replace public welfare and Social Security, and the abolition of the graduated income tax. Goldwater also voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But Democrats' portrayal of Goldwater as an extremist who would abolish Social Security and risk nuclear war won Johnson an overwhelming victory. Democrats also took 2-to-1 majorities in both houses of Congress. But the 1964 campaign also launched the modern conservative movement. Goldwater carried 5 Deep South states, and George Wallace, the segregationist Democratic governor of Alabama, had done well in primaries in northern states such as Indiana and Wisconsin. Also in 1964, California voters approved Proposition 14, which repealed a 1963 law that banned racial discrimination in real estate sales, celebrated by conservatives as a move that would give white homeowners freedom against government interference. The Goldwater campaign and other stirrings showed that the 1960s had a conservative side. In 1960, students inspired by the conservative intellectual William F. Buckley gathered at his home in Sharon, Connecticut, and formed the Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF. The YAF's Sharon Statement advocated the free market as the basis of personal freedom, limited government, and the destruction of global communism in the Cold War. YAF members became Goldwater's shock troops in his campaign. Goldwater also found support in the suburbs of California and the Southwest, where immigrants from elsewhere in the United States had come to work in defense-related industries located there. These suburbanites were the base for later conservative insurgencies. Goldwater's winning of 5 Deep South states also showed that Republicans might take advantage of white resentments against civil rights and move the South away from the Democratic Party. Although conservatives eventually abandoned the blatant language of racial superiority and inferiority, their calls for law and order and their stigmatization of welfare had strong racial overtones. Reform efforts increased. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama. Defying a ban by Governor Wallace, King tried to lead a march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. State police met the marchers with cattle prods, whips, and tear gas. Once more, images of brutal police attacks on nonviolent demonstrators flashed on televisions worldwide. The government was forced to take action, and Johnson quickly asked Congress to pass a law securing the right to vote. Congress soon enacted the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters. Black Southerners finally regained the suffrage that had been denied them since the end of the 19th century through Jim Crow. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution also outlawed the poll tax, which had prevented poor blacks and some whites from voting in the South. By 1965, the belief spread by the civil rights movement that racism could no longer create second-class citizens affected other policy debates as well. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act ended the national origins quota system of immigration that had excluded Asians and restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The law established new racially neutral criteria for immigration, including family reunification and the demand for skills needed in America. Yet, because of growing hostility in the Southwest to Mexican immigration, the law for the first time sharply limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere to 120,000 per year. This provision of the Act created the category of what was known as, quote, illegal aliens for migrants from elsewhere in the Americas. The law set the quota for the rest of the world at 170,000 per year. Exceptions for refugees from communist countries soon let immigration exceed the limits, however. Although immigrants were only 5% of the nation's population at the time, the reform caused a dramatic shift to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia as the sources of immigration to the United States. The Great Society. After his 1964 election victory, Johnson outlined the most sweeping plan since the New Deal for government action to promote the general welfare of citizens. Johnson's programs of 1965 through 1967, known as the Great Society, provided health services to the poor and elderly in the new Medicaid and Medicare programs, and poured federal funds into education and urban development. New cabinet-level offices, such as the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, and new agencies such as Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and a National Public Broadcasting Network, or PBS, were all established under the Great Society. These measures greatly expanded the federal government's powers and completed and extended the social agenda, except national health insurance, that had stalled in Congress since 1938 with the New Deal. Yet, the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not depression. In the mid-1960s, the economy was expanding, fueled by higher government spending and a tax cut passed in 1964 for individuals and businesses. Johnson and Democratic liberals believed economic growth would fund more government programs and improve Americans' quality of life altogether. war on poverty was the centerpiece of the Great Society. Launched in 1964, this effort was inspired in part by politicians' rediscovery of poverty amid 1950s affluence. In 1962, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, showed that 40 to 50 million Americans still lived in poverty in urban and rural areas, removed from middle-class life and consciousness. Harrington showed that the mechanization of agriculture and the automation of industry had ultimately cut jobs for the unskilled workers. The civil rights movement highlighted the problem of poverty for blacks, but Harrington showed that the majority of the poor were white. While Democrats during the New Deal had attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions, the Johnson administration believed poverty was caused by a lack of skills, proper attitudes, and work habits. The war on poverty did not directly fight poverty. Through efforts like works programs, spreading unions, or preventing businesses from moving production to the low-wage South or overseas. It did not address economic changes that reduced well-paid factory jobs and left poor rural and urban families with few opportunities. Perhaps the most successful and popular program was food stamps, a form of direct aid. But the war on poverty sought to equip the poor with skills and to motivate them. A new Office of Economic Opportunity created Head Start, which was early childhood education. It also created job training, legal services, college scholarships, and volunteers in service to America, or VISTA. This was a domestic version of the Peace Corps. It also created community action programs that required poor people to participate in forming local policies, which ultimately fostered resentment among local officials used to controlling federal funds. Freedom and equality. Johnson defended the Great Society in a, quote, New Deal language of freedom, reinforced by civil rights. Recognizing that black poverty caused by past and present racism was different from white poverty, he tried to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. He argued that economic liberty was more than equal opportunity. But while Johnson's Great Society may not have achieved equality, it did reaffirm the idea of social citizenship. It was the greatest effort in American history to mobilize the powers of the federal government to aid less fortunate Americans, especially those, like blacks, who had been excluded from the original New Deal entitlements, like Social Security. Combined with incredible economic growth, the war on poverty reduced poverty rates from 22 to 13% of American families during the 1960s. But the amount spent on the programs was too low to end poverty or transform life in poor urban areas. By the 1990s, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled jobs had greatly narrowed. But deindustrialization and urban decay, combined with residential segregation, kept the wealth of white households 10 times as great as that of blacks and left nearly a quarter of all black children in poverty. The changing black movement. Focus question: how did the civil rights movement change in the mid-1960s? Increased violence and civil rights. The civil rights movement entered a crisis when it moved from demanding access to schools, public facilities, and voting booths, as it had in the past, to economic disparities between blacks and whites. In the mid-1960s, economic problems became a civil rights priority. Violence in northern ghettos brought attention to racial injustice and inequalities in jobs, education, and housing, which the end of legal segregation did not solve. The hostility of later race relations emerged from many whites' beliefs that blacks had won equality in civil rights and voting rights laws, and they needed no further assistance, while blacks, aware of discrimination in jobs, education, housing, and the criminal justice system, called for more government action. The first riots, actually battles between blacks and mostly white police, erupted in Harlem in 1964. The larger uprising of 1965 in Watts, the black ghetto of Los Angeles, saw 50,000 rioters attack police and firemen. They ultimately looted white-owned businesses and burned buildings. After the National Guard restored order, 35 had been killed, 900 injured, and $20 million in property was destroyed. By the summer of 1967, urban riots seemed everywhere. Some feared racial war. Urban rebellions left 23 dead in Newark and 43 dead in Detroit, huge parts of which were devastated after the riots. Johnson appointed a commission to study the causes of urban disorder, whose report blamed them on, quote, segregation and poverty, and indicted white racism and claimed that the society was becoming harshly divided along racial lines. Civil rights activists, knowing that black unemployment was twice that of whites and that the average black family had little more than half the income of white families, moved to address economic freedom for black Americans. In 1964, King called for a Bill of Rights that would offer positive economic rights to African Americans, what would become affirmative action in the future. In 1966, he launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, demanding an end to discrimination by employers and unions, equal access to mortgages, the integration of public housing, and decentralized low-income housing. But King's movement was no match for the political machine of Chicago's mayor, Richard J. Daley, and white homeowners who fiercely opposed him. King's nonviolent attacks failed in the North. King became more radical and started to call for a, quote, better distribution of wealth for all God's children. Malcolm X and Black Power. If the early civil rights movement had clear objectives and profound accomplishments, the later movement saw political fragmentation and very few victories. Even at the height of integration struggles, the incendiary orator Malcolm X insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and avoid working with whites altogether. Born Malcolm Little, he committed several crimes as a youth. Malcolm X converted in jail to the Nation of Islam, or black Muslims, who preached a message of white evil and black discipline. Malcolm dropped his, quote, slave surname in favor of X, symbolizing blacks' separation from African ancestry. When he was released from prison, Malcolm X became a spokesman for the black Muslims and a vehement critic of the integrationism and nonviolence of King and the earlier civil rights movement. Unlike King, Malcolm X saw nothing redemptive in American values at all. On a 1964 trip to Mecca, however, Islam's spiritual center, Malcolm X saw interracial harmony between Muslims and moderated his message, embracing the possibility of interracial cooperation for radical change in America. He had had an epiphany. But his assassination in early 1965 left no consistent ideology or organization behind him. His calls for black independence inspired the urban poor and younger civil rights activists, and his 1966 autobiography, which was of course published after his death, became a bestseller. Malcolm X was the father of, quote, Black Power, a slogan popularized by the SNCC's leader, Stokely Carmichael, in 1966 during a march in Mississippi. Black Power rallied those angry with the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights activists, white attempts to dominate the movement, and the movement's inability to influence the economic plight of urban blacks. Black Power suggested everything from electing more blacks to political office, to the belief that blacks were a colonized people whose freedom could be won only through revolutionary struggles for self-determination. The idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and inspired cultural pride. The word Negro was abandoned for Afro-American, and African dress and hairstyles were celebrated. Previously, interracial civil rights groups like the SNCC and CORE also repudiated their inclusion of whites, and they soon disintegrated as a result. New groups sprang up instead. Most prominently, the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California in 1966 to protest the policy of brutality there. The Black Panthers won notoriety for advocating armed self-defense, and their militant stance and actions alarmed moderate blacks and many whites. Troubled by internal disputes and police and FBI repression, the Black Panthers had disintegrated by the early 1970s.